Pruitt had been standing at the register for almost 4 minutes, and the word he needed still would not come. It was there. He could feel the shape of it sitting somewhere behind his teeth, round and familiar, a word he had said 10,000 times across 71 years of living. But his mouth made a soft clicking sound instead, and then nothing, and the young cashier looked at him the way people had started looking at him in the 18 months since the stroke, patient on the surface, already gone somewhere else underneath. "Sir, did you want a bag?" He did not want a bag. He wanted the other thing, the thing he had come in for, and he gestured with his good hand toward the glass case at the front of the store where the small white cakes sat in their plastic clamshells. The cashier followed his hand but didn't understand, because he was pointing at the whole case and not at the one cake, the chocolate one with the little sugar violets on top, and how was she supposed to know that the violets were the entire point? Outside the wide front windows of Halverson's Market, the first real snow of the year had begun to come down in earnest, fat and slow under the streetlights of a small Ohio town called Ridgemont. It was a Tuesday in the second week of December, a little after 6 in the evening, and the store was busier than Walter had counted on. He had waited until what he thought was a quiet hour. He had been wrong. Behind him, the line had grown to 7 people. He could hear them. That was the cruel arithmetic of his condition. His ears worked perfectly, his mind worked nearly as well as it ever had, and only the bridge between the two, the narrow plank that carried thought into speech, had buckled and given way. So he heard the woman 2 places back shift her basket from one arm to the other and sigh through her nose. He heard a man in a canvas work jacket mutter, "Come on, buddy," not even quietly, the way you'd say it to a dog that wouldn't get off the porch. He heard the wet squeak of boots as people leaned to see around him, trying to gauge how long this was going to take. Walter's face went hot. He pulled the small spiral notebook out of his coat pocket. His daughter-in-law had given it to him, told him to write things down when the words wouldn't come. But his right hand, the bad one, couldn't hold the pen steady, and his left had never learned the trick of it. The letters came out crooked and enormous, C-A-K. He turned it toward the cashier and her eyes flicked down and then back up, and he watched her decide that she did not have time for this. "I can get a manager," she said, which meant I give up, and she was already lifting her hand to wave at someone across the store. That was the moment Walter nearly walked out. He felt his weight shift back toward the door. He had $11 folded in his shirt pocket and a tradition he had kept for 43 years, and for one long second the humiliation of standing there in front of all those impatient strangers seemed bigger than the tradition, big enough to swallow it whole. He thought, "I'll come back tomorrow, early. I'll come back when nobody's here." Except tomorrow was the 14th, and the cake had to be today, because Ruth's birthday was the 13th, and you do not buy a woman her birthday cake the day after. So he stayed. He stood there in his good wool coat with the snow melting off his shoulders, gripping the little notebook, and he felt about as small as a grown man can feel. 4 people back in the line, a woman named Cora Whitfield watched the whole thing happen and felt something old turn over in her chest. Cora was 38 years old and tired in a way that had stopped being a temporary condition somewhere around the previous spring. She had come into Halverson's on her way home from her second job, the one cleaning offices downtown that ran from 3 to 6, before she had to be back at the diner at 7 for the dinner into close shift. Standing beside her, holding the hem of her coat because he wasn't tall enough to hold her hand without reaching, was her son Micah, who was 7 and had the kind of solemn, watchful eyes that made teachers say he was an old soul, which Cora had decided was a polite way of saying he worried too much for a kid. He worried because there was a lot to worry about. He knew, the way kids always know even when you try to keep it from them, that money was thin in their house. He had stopped asking for things at the grocery store the way other children asked, and that small piece of grown-up restraint in her little boy was one of the things that could still, on a bad night, make Cora cry in the car. They were only there for bread and a half-gallon of milk in a box of the off-brand macaroni Micah liked. $6 and change. In and out. She had timed it down to the minute. But she was watching the old man at the register, and she knew exactly what she was looking at, because she had spent the last 3 years of her father's life looking at it. Her dad, Eugene, had a stroke the winter Cora was 16, a big one, the kind that takes the right side of the body and most of the language and leaves a person trapped inside a self that still works fine, still has opinions and jokes and a temper, with no way to get any of it out. Her mother had left long before that, so it had fallen to Cora, a teenager, to learn how to talk to a man who could no longer talk back. She'd learned that you don't finish his sentences. You don't say "take your time" in that bright fake voice, because he can hear the lie in it. You learn his gestures. You learn that pointing means a category and a long look means a specific thing inside the category. You learn to ask yes or no questions, slowly, one at a time, and to wait, really wait, count to 10 in your head if you have to for the nod or the shake of the head. You learn that the worst thing you can do to a person who has lost their words is to act like they've lost their mind along with them. She had carried all of that with her into adulthood like a strange inheritance, and standing in line at Halverson's 18 years later, watching a stranger's dignity come apart at a checkout counter, she found she could not keep standing still. "Stay right here, baby," she told Micah, and she stepped out of the line. The cashier had her hand up to call the manager. The man in the canvas jacket had pulled out his phone with the showy impatience of someone who wanted everyone to see how put upon he was. Cora came up alongside the old man, close but not too close, and she didn't touch him, because you don't grab at a person who's already feeling cornered. She angled herself so she was beside him instead of in front of him, the way you'd stand next to a friend, not across from a problem. "Hey," she said, easy and unhurried, like they had all the time in the world and the line behind them had simply ceased to exist. "I think I can help. Is that all right?" Walter turned his head. He looked at her with something wary in his face, the bracing for pity that she recognized too, and then she said the thing that changed it. "My dad couldn't talk after his stroke either. I got pretty good at this." She gave a small, real smile, not the customer service kind. "So, we'll figure it out. No rush." She watched the wariness go out of him all at once, the way air goes out of a held breath. His eyes, pale gray rimmed red from the cold or from something else, filled, and he blinked hard and looked at the floor, and he blinked hard and looked at the floor, and Cora pretended not to see it, because that was a kindness too. "Okay," she said, "you came in for something specific, you know exactly what it is." It wasn't a question and she didn't pose it like one. "Show me where it is and I'll do the talking part. You do the picking." He pointed again at the glass case by the front, and this time, because she was watching the way she'd learned to watch, she saw that his finger wasn't sweeping across the whole case. It was angled. Low and to the left. "The cakes," she said, "up front, the little ones." His head came up and he nodded, hard, twice, and the relief of being understood broke across his face so plainly that the young cashier, who was 19 and had been having what she'd thought was a bad day, suddenly felt ashamed of herself. "Okay, come on." Cora glanced back at Micah, who had stayed exactly where she put him, watching everything with those serious eyes. "Micah, honey, grab our stuff and come up here with me." The man in the canvas jacket made a noise. "Are we starting over? I've been standing here." "It'll take 2 minutes," Cora said, not unkindly but not backing down either, in a voice that had spent 10 years managing drunk men at a diner counter at 1 in the morning. "He was here first. We're almost there." She walked the old man up to the bakery case, slow enough that he could keep pace with the dragging right foot she'd noticed but hadn't mentioned. The little cake sat in 2 neat rows. There was vanilla with white frosting, vanilla with pink, lemon, red velvet, and at the end, chocolate, each one topped with a tiny cluster of pale purple sugar flowers. "All right," she said, crouching a little so she was at his level, the way she used to crouch by her father's wheelchair. "I'm going to point. You stop me when I'm right." She moved her finger along the row. Vanilla. He didn't move. Lemon. Nothing. Red velvet. Nothing. Chocolate. Chocolate. Nothing. Chocolate. His hand shot out and gripped her forearm, gentle but sure, and he made a sound, an an urgent sound that meant yes, that one, that's the one. "The chocolate," she said, "with the violets." And the old man, this stranger, brought his other hand up over his mouth and nodded and started, silently, to cry. She didn't make a thing of it. She straightened up, opened the case, took out the chocolate cake in its clamshell, and held it where he could see it. "This exact one? Or do you want me to check if there's a fresher one in back?" He shook his head, "This one," and patted the front of his coat where, Cora would learn, he kept his money so he wouldn't lose it. They went back to the register together. The line had not, as it turned out, dissolved into chaos. People had watched. The woman 2 places back was no longer sighing. The man in the canvas jacket had put his phone away and was looking at the floor. Something had shifted in the temperature of the room, the way it does sometimes when a group of strangers is forced to witness a thing they were all, a minute ago, complicit in making worse. Cora set the cake on the counter. The cashier, her name tag said Harley, rang it up with a carefulness that hadn't been there before. "349, she said, and then, quietly, to Walter. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry." Walter worked the money out of his shirt pocket with his good hand. He had it folded into careful quarters, the $11, and Cora saw the way he handled it, the slow precision of a man for whom every physical task had become a small deliberate project, and she understood without being told that this was probably most of what he had on him, and that the cake mattered enough to spend it. He laid a 5 on the counter. Haley made change. And then, because there was a moment where everyone was just standing there, Micah, who had been silent this whole time, holding the bread and milk and macaroni against his chest, spoke up in the clear, unembarrassed voice of a 7-year-old. "Is it somebody's birthday?" Walter looked down at the boy. Something complicated moved across his face. He set down the change Haley had given him, and he reached into the inner pocket of his coat, and with shaking fingers he took out a photograph. Old, soft-cornered, the colors gone slightly orange the way photographs from the 70s go. He held it out, not to Cora, but to the boy. Micah took it carefully in both hands. Cora leaned to look. It was a young woman, dark hair set in the rolled style of decades past, a flowered dress, a laugh caught mid-motion so that she was a little blurred, as if even the camera couldn't quite hold her still. On the back, in a young man's confident handwriting, it said Ruth, June 1974. "Is this your wife?" Micah asked. Walter nodded. "Is it her birthday?" He nodded again, and his chin trembled, and he made a small gesture with his free hand, a flat hand, palm down, lowering slowly toward the floor, a gesture Cora's father had used too, the universal sign that crossed every language barrier including this one. "She's gone. She's passed." "Oh," Micah said softly, and then, because children go straight to the heart of things that adults walk around, "But you still got her a cake." Walter's whole face crumpled and reassembled itself into a smile that was mostly grief, and he nodded, and he reached out and laid his good hand on the top of Micah's head, just for a second, the way old men do. Cora's throat was tight. She made herself breathe. 43 years, she would later learn it had been 43 Decembers of the chocolate cake with the violets, because that was the kind Ruth had carried at their wedding and the kind he'd bought her on every birthday since. And he had not been about to let a stroke in a difficult cashier and a line full of impatient strangers be the reason the street finally broke. But she didn't know all that yet. What she knew, standing at the register in Halverson's with the snow coming down outside and her own evening ticking away toward a 7 o'clock shift she could not afford to be late for, was that she was not going to let this man walk home alone in the dark carrying a cake for a woman who wasn't there to eat it. "How are you getting home?" she asked. He gestured vaguely toward the door, toward the snow. "You're walking?" A nod. In this, the snow had picked up. It was the wet, heavy kind that turned to ice on the sidewalks by morning. "How far?" He held up a hand and made a so-so wobble, then pointed in a direction Cora knew led toward the older streets behind the high school, the little post-war houses with the deep front porches. 6, maybe 7 blocks. Not far for a man with 2 good legs. A long way for one who dragged a foot and was 71 and crying. Cora did the math she was always doing. The diner was at 7. It was 6:20. Her car was in the lot. 7 blocks there, 7 back, the time to get him inside. She'd be cutting it close. She might have to call Dolores and ask her to cover the first 15 minutes, and Dolores would grumble, and Cora would owe her, and the whole fragile clockwork of her week would have to absorb one more thing. She didn't even really decide. She just heard herself say it. "I've got my car right outside. Let me run you home." "It's nasty out there." He shook his head, the automatic refusal of a man who had spent a lifetime not being a burden. But it was a weak shake, and she was already gathering up the cake. "It's not a problem," she said, in the voice she used on Micah when he insisted he wasn't tired and was very clearly tired. "It's snowing and you've got precious cargo." She nodded at the cake. "We can't let that get ruined. Come on." So that is how Cora Whitfield, who had $6 of groceries in 40 minutes before her second job, came to be driving a stranger named Walter Pruitt home through the first snow of December, with her 7-year-old son buckled in the back seat holding a chocolate cake flat on his lap like it was made of glass. The car was an '09 Corolla with 210,000 miles on it and a heater that took a while to think about it before it committed. Walter sat in the passenger seat and held Ruth's photograph in his lap and looked out at the snow falling through the headlights, and nobody talked much, which was fine. Cora had learned, with her father, that silence with a person who couldn't speak didn't have to be awkward. It could just be company. "You gonna want to take a left up here?" she'd ask and he'd nod or shake his head, and that was conversation enough. His house was a small white one with green shutters and a wheelchair ramp built over half the front steps, built recently. Cora could tell, the lumber still pale. There were Christmas lights up, a single strand along the porch rail, and she found herself wondering who'd hung them, because it clearly hadn't been Walter, not with that hand. She put the car in park and came around to help him out, and Micah, unprompted, climbed out the back with the cake held in front of him like an offering. And they made a slow procession up the ramp through the snow, the three of them, the porch light yellow and the flakes coming down soft and steady. At the door, Walter fumbled with his keys, got the door open. Warm air and the smell of an old house, wood and dust and something faintly like cinnamon. He turned in the doorway. He wanted to say something. Cora could see him reaching for it, the word or the words, the thank you that wouldn't assemble itself, and she watched the frustration build in him, the helpless fury of a man with a full heart and a broken bridge. "Hey," she said gently. "I know, you don't have to say it, I know." But he held up one finger, wait, and he went back into the house, into the dim of the front room, and they heard a drawer open and close, and he came back with a small wooden object that he pressed into Micah's hands. It was a bird, a little carved bird, the size of an egg, worn smooth and dark with handling, a wren or a sparrow, something small and brown bird ordinary, the kind of thing a person carves to keep his hands busy. Cora would find out later that Walter had been a high school shop teacher for 31 years and that the house was full of these, birds and boats and tiny perfect chairs, and that since the stroke his good hand still remembered how, even when his mouth didn't. "For me?" Micah breathed. Walter nodded. He closed the boy's small fingers around the little bird with his own big trembling hand. And then he looked at Cora, and he pressed his good hand flat against the center of his own chest, and he held it there, and he looked at her with those wet gray eyes, and she understood. That was the whole sentence. That was thank you and you saw me and you didn't have to and I won't forget it, all of it, said with one hand on one heart, no words required. "You're welcome, Walter," she said. Her own eyes were stinging now and she let them. Happy birthday to Ruth, she was beautiful. They left him there in his warm doorway with his cake and his photograph and his strand of porch lights, and they drove away into the snow, and Cora made it to the diner at 7:04, and Dolores grumbled, and the night went on the way nights do. She thought that was the end of it. A small good thing in a hard winter, the kind you carry for a day or two and then lose under the weight of the next thing and the thing after that. It was Micah who wouldn't let it go. He slept with the little wooden bird on his nightstand. He asked about Walter at breakfast. Was he okay? Did he eat the cake? Was he lonely? He asked the questions Cora was too tired and too practical to ask herself, and somewhere in the asking he wore down her sense that you couldn't just go check on a man you'd met for 10 minutes at a grocery store. The Saturday after, with a rare morning off, she baked a tin of the oatmeal cookies her father used to like, and she and Micah drove back to the little white house with the green shutters, and they knocked. Walter opened the door and his face, when he saw them, did a thing that made the whole drive worth it. That was the start of it, not a grand thing. Just a small, steady, ordinary thing, the kind that the world is actually held together by. They started stopping in on Saturdays, then it was Saturdays and the odd weeknight. Micah, it turned out, was a patient listener, and Walter, it turned out, was a patient teacher even without his words, and by February the boy was sitting at Walter's kitchen table on a stack of phone books learning how to hold a carving knife the safe way. The old man's big steady left hand guiding the small one. Walter's daughter-in-law, the one who'd given him the notebook, who lived 2 towns over and came when she could but had 3 kids and a job of her own, called Cora one night in tears to thank her, said her father-in-law had stopped answering the phone after the stroke, had gone so far inside himself she'd been frightened, and that he'd started talking about the boy and the boy's mother, and had asked her to help him write a Christmas list, which he hadn't done in 2 years. And here is the part that Cora never expected, the part she would tell people about later when they asked her why she'd bothered, why a woman with nothing to spare had spent it on a stranger. In the spring, she lost the cleaning job. The company downsized the contract and 3 of them got let go on a Friday with 2 weeks' notice, and Cora drove home from that meeting and sat in the Corolla in her own driveway and put her head on the steering wheel, because the cleaning job was the difference, the margin. The thing that kept the lights on and the macaroni in the cabinet, and she did not know what she was going to do. She didn't tell Walter. She would never have told Walter. You don't lay your troubles on a 71-year-old man with a cake for his dead wife. But Micah told him, because Micah was 7 and told Walter everything, and the next Saturday Walter had his daughter-in-law on the phone and through her, slowly, carefully, the old man supplying the words and the woman translating his determination into a plan, they made Cora an offer. Walter needed someone in the house, not a nurse exactly, someone to be there in the afternoons and evenings, to help with the meals he couldn't quite manage one-handed, to drive him to the doctor and the store and the cemetery on the days he wanted to go, to be a person in the room so the house wasn't so quiet. His daughter-in-law would pay it out of the account she managed for him. It was a real wage, a fair one, more than the cleaning job had paid, and it had hours that let Cora keep the diner if she wanted and be home when Micah got off the school bus. The bus that stopped, it happened, at the corner 3 houses down from Walter's, because Micah was already spending half his afternoons there anyway. Cora said no at first. Of course she did. She said it was charity and she didn't take charity, and Walter, through the phone, through his daughter-in-law, but unmistakably in his own stubborn voice told her it was not charity, it was a job, and that he was a difficult old man who needed help whether she gave it to him or not. And that he would rather give the money to someone who had already proven she knew how to talk to a man who couldn't talk back than to a stranger from an agency who'd say take your time in that bright fake voice. He had remembered. After all those weeks, he had remembered the exact thing she'd said to him at the register, and he gave it back to her, and that was how she knew he meant it. She said yes. So the woman who had stepped out of a grocery line on a snowy Tuesday because she couldn't stand to watch a stranger be humiliated found that the kindness had circled all the way back around and landed in her own lap. The way kindness sometimes does and sometimes, it has to be said, does not, but did, this time, for her. Cora and Micah more or less moved their afternoons into the little white house with the green shutters. The pale new lumber of the wheelchair ramp went gray and weathered and ordinary. The Christmas lights came down and, the next December, went back up, hung this time by Cora on a ladder with Micah holding it steady and Walter directing the whole operation from the porch with his good hand, perfectly happy, perfectly bossy, getting his point across just fine. And every year on the 13th of December, the 3 of them drove to Halverson's together, Walter no longer alone, no longer dreading the counter, and they bought the small chocolate cake with the sugar violets, and Haley, who still worked there and who lit up every time she saw them come in, rang it up with a smile and never once made him feel rushed. They took it home and put a single candle in it, and they sang to a woman in a flowered dress in an orange-tinted photograph, the 3 of them and sometimes Walter's daughter-in-law and her kids when they could make the drive. A whole crowded warm kitchen of people gathered around a cake for someone none of the children had ever met. Walter never got his words all the way back. The doctors had told him early on that he probably wouldn't, and they were right. But Cora came to believe, over the years she knew him, that the words had never been the most important thing anyway, that everything that mattered most about a person could be said with a photograph held out to a curious child, or a hand laid flat against a chest, or a small carved bird pressed into a boy's open palm. She had learned that the first time, with her father, in the hardest years of her life. Walter just reminded her. On the windowsill above her kitchen sink, in the house she could finally afford to stop worrying about quite so much, Cora kept the little wooden bird. Micah had given it to her on her birthday that first spring, solemn about it the way he was solemn about everything, and said she should have it because she was the one who'd stopped, and a person who stopped deserved something to remember it by. She kept it where she'd see it every day, doing the dishes, looking out at the yard. A small brown ordinary bird, worn smooth, made by the steady hand of a man whose mouth had failed him, but whose heart never had, on a Tuesday in December when the snow came down and one tired woman stepped out of a line. I still keep that little wooden bird on the windowsill above my sink, and most mornings I don't even really look at it anymore, the way you stop seeing the things you love because they'd become part of the house. But every now and then I'll be standing there with my hands in the dishwater, and I'll catch it out of the corner of my eye, and the whole thing comes back to me, the snow, the line at Halverson's, Walter's hand shaking over that little notebook with the word that wouldn't come. I think about how close I came to staying in that line. I was tired. I was always tired back then. I had a shift to make in $6 of groceries and exactly no extra anything to give a stranger. The easiest thing in the world would have been to stand there and feel a little bad and let somebody else handle it. What I've learned is that the moments that change your life almost never announce themselves. They show up looking like an inconvenience. They show up at the worst possible time, when you have the least to spare, and they ask you to do the right thing anyway. And whether you do it isn't really about whether you have the energy. It's about who you've already decided to be before the moment ever arrives. I could only help Walter because of the hardest years of my own life. 3 years of caring for my father after his stroke, learning to wait, learning to read a hand instead of a mouth. At the time it felt like nothing but loss. But suffering, if you let it, teaches you how to see people. It hands you a kind of understanding you'd never have asked for and could never have bought. I didn't know any of that was useful until the night it was the only useful thing in the room. And the part I think about most is that none of it would have happened without my Micah tugging my coat, the way kids do, going straight to the heart of a thing the rest of us are too busy to feel. He didn't calculate. He just saw a person who needed help and said so out loud. What I want my son to carry out of that winter isn't a tidy lesson. It's 3 things and they hold each other up. The decency to stop when stopping cost you something. The patience to actually understand a person instead of just deciding about them. And the plain stubbornness to keep choosing both, on the tired days, on the broke days, when no one's watching and there's nothing in it for you. Because here's the thing nobody tells you. The kindness I gave Walter circled right back and caught me when I fell. I didn't do it for that. You can't, but that's how it works, more often than we believe. You hold the door for someone in the dark, and years later you find out it was your own door all along.